Good evening. Welcome back to the Bible Speaks today from Latonia Baptist Church Television Ministries. This is the fifth chapter, if you will, of our fairly extended series about the writers of the Bible. And as I explained, I think last week or the week before, we were going to call it Who Wrote the Bible, but unfortunately some years ago we did a smaller version of this. Didn't take quite so long. And our filing system, computer system, you know how that works, doesn't like the same title reoccurring again. And of course the DVD filing system definitely doesn't like that. So we changed it to Writers of the Bible. But basically what we are talking about is who wrote the Bible, who physically wrote it. Okay, and those of you who've been watching on a regular basis will know that it wasn't Moses, right? And those of you who only just tuned in are now getting the feathers and the tar ready. But just stay with me for a little while, and we'll struggle it through. I must apologize for the last two broadcasts. As I've said so many times, we record two programs together, as we will this evening, this one and then the next one, and then you see them a week apart. Last time we recorded, I think I was over the flu, but I think my body hadn't quite recognized that fact because I'm told by the studio that I was coughing and spluttering all the way through it. And I do apologize for that. Normally you'd say, well, why don't you just cancel and do it again? Unfortunately, our time frame is such that unless we get these recorded and then into the TV station at the right time, of course, they won't go on. So we always sort of record ahead. It's always a mad scramble if we're recording the program and it's going on that week. It's a really lot of pressure. And I, like most of you would agree, you don't need any more pressure. And I want to reiterate too, for those of you who are watching on a regular basis, that you better be in for the long haul, because this isn't going to be done in a few weeks. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and there's a lot of background, because one of the things about Bible study is it's very hard to talk about Bible study if you don't look at what's happening around them. You know, if you read the Bible, the kingdom split, okay, we did this, did that. If you don't understand the nuances of it, shall we say, then it becomes very difficult to understand just what is happening, especially in the next few weeks as we get into defining the actual characters, people, persons who put it all together. And you remember, if you were watching last week, that we talked about the split, where Solomon's son Rehoboam was proclaimed king at Solomon's death, and the northern tribes, consisting of the 10 other tribes other than Judah and Benjamin, who are the southern side. And people get confused about that, between Israel and Judah. You tend to think of Israel as being the predominant, but in fact, Judah, the tribe of Judah, and Benjamin, which is real tiny, were actually as big as all the other tribes put together. And I want to refer you back to the early part of these programs, where I mentioned how small, in relation to other places in the world, the country of Israel is, the country we're talking about. And that these tribes were not thousands and thousands and thousands of people. They were relatively small, each tribe, Judah being bigger than the most. It's hard for modern Bible readers to get their heads around numbers. First of all, the Bible, I'm going to get shot for this, I know, but the Bible exaggerates numbers. It does. It's a common practice in ancient writings to, if you've got 10 men, then you call it 100 because it makes you seem more important. And the Bible exaggerates numbers. A good example of this, of course, is when the Israelites left Egypt. I mean, if you read or see the recent movie, there's a great movie called, I forgot what it's called now. Anyway, it's about Moses and the Exodus. I mean, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people. Well, first of all, to move that many people across the desert for any length of time, and certainly in the beginning, without supplies, without some form of support system, which they wouldn't have because they're on their own, is almost impossible. And in any case, looking at the Sinai Desert, it could not have supported over 1 million people, which is what the Bible would have you believe left Egypt, for any length of time at all. At all. Now, I'm not saying the Israelites weren't more in number when they finally came to Israel after the 40 years, but you know, it was a numbers are not all they seem to be, and we'll find that out as we do go into this in more detail. But okay, let's go briefly recap the last few minutes of last week. But you know, the kingdom split. Okay. They propose a new king in the northern tribes, the 10 tribes left, and he becomes Jeroboam. Both names meant fruitful, multiplying, you know, we're doing well. And Jeroboam sets up his own, you know, its own branch, if you will, of Judaism. Now, bear in mind this is two countries, like North and South America, if you will, you know, during the Revolution, Civil War, sorry. Spoke the same language, some went to the same schools, had the same religious ideas. You know, everything was the same, except that just couldn't get along, right? So what Jeroboam does is establishes different holidays, so they won't be celebrating the same time as those people in the south. And he comes up with new symbols. Now, I got taken to task in the grocery store. When else does people take me to task, right? About talking about images, you know, golden calves and things like that, you know, and how the Bible specifically says, you know, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt have no graven images. I want to be very clear on this. Jeroboam has two new symbols, golden calves, as symbols of their faith. They put them in Gad and in down the south, the southern part of the country. Judah also had its images, the two cherubs on the ark, and they aren't supposed to represent the God. In other words, they're not idols. They are just to indicate that this is the presence of God. All right, so they're not worshipping idols or anything. It's just that, you know, like, hey, God lives here. Here's his sign. Okay. And as I say, they became two golden calves, and Jerusalem had the two golden cherubs. And what Jeroboam did to try and get away from the impact of Jerusalem, because if you think about it, if you've got the same religion and the same temple to go to, Jerusalem is in the south, northern people would all go to Jerusalem. Well, after a short period of this, I'm sure Jeroboam thought, hey, they're taking all the money and buying all the stuff in Jerusalem and the you know, the sacrifices and that. I need to stop this. So he establishes two holy cities, Dan in the north and Bethel in the south. And he puts these worship centers with the golden calves outside to indicate that these are worship centers, to attract the people. And of course, Bethel is on the border between north and south. In fact, as we'll see later on in our studies, both sides sort of claimed it, if you will. Maybe the line went through the town, I don't know. But, you know, it was a bone of contention between them. So people traveling, if you were south to go to Jerusalem, get to Bethel and think, well, hey, we don't need to go all the way to Jerusalem. There's a temple worship place here, easier to get to. And so Jeroboam quite neatly tried to contain the tourist traffic, shall we say. Then comes something you need to know something about for later on, if you know what I mean, a bit of background. Jeroboam then chose priests to staff these places, okay? Now his choice of priests is critical, absolutely critical. The Levites in the north, the priests in the north, right? Previous to the split, to the country split, if you remember, Solomon gave King Hiram of Syria 20 cities, 20 little towns. In other words, he moved the border and said, hey, in return for all the cedar and the wood for the temple. big bone of contention at the time. The Bible doesn't say much about it, simply that he does it. But you can imagine the people in the north probably didn't feel very happy about it. One day they wake up and they're not Israelites anymore, they're Syrians, or the taxes are being paid to King Hiram. But literally, and I don't know that they actually moved the border or they just gave the taxation, all the money from these people goes to you, probably to pay for the timber. But it was an act that was part of the reason why the northern tribes seceded from the coalition. They felt like they were being taken for granted, and they were. Solomon, for all Solomon was supposed to be the really, really wise king, he did some dumb, stupid things, biblically. You don't believe me? Okay, well, we know about splitting carving the child in two with a sword. They're very wise, figure out who the mother was. But he married, or had arrangements with, a lot of the other countries around him and married their daughters, the old marry by to make the pacts between them all work. And he allowed these quote unquote pagan ladies to have set up their own altars and their own places of worship, totally against the teachings of the Israelites. So that was a bit stupid too. And if you go into Solomon's life, and we should do that one of these days, it'd be interesting to see just how many mistakes, as Solomon became more and more powerful, how many mistakes he made. Anyway, the other thing about the north was that Shiloh was in the north, and theoretically, at least as far as we know, had the tabernacle. So it's kind of an important place. I mean, in Judges, Samuel anoints Saul and David at Shiloh. It's a big key place in the overall country's religious history. Never mind that they're split now, Shiloh's still important. Remember we talked about Abiathar, one of the two priests under David, who got expelled by Solomon for supporting the opposition, remember, against his brother Ishmael? And then Ishmael gets knocked off, and the general gets knocked off, but this priest Abiathar is exiled to a little town just outside Jerusalem, so they keep an eye on him. That was a big slap in the face to the priests of Shiloh. So the priests of Shiloh were out of power. In other words, they weren't the few. The Levites in Jerusalem were now the people of power. Get to call the shots, get the ear of the king. So, and this is a big thing. We're talking about a country that is run as a theocracy, where technically the king rules at the pleasure of the priests and prophets and the tribes, and that's all starting to go away. We're now getting to where the king rules regardless of what anybody says, and the priests don't have the effect that they used to have. So they're out of power. I mean, you've got to remember that the prophet who instigated the succession and chose Jeroboam as king, by the way, because they were still doing it on the old, you can't be king unless the prophets nominate you, was called Ahijah. And he's from Shiloh. So you would have expected, in gratitude, of course, that King Jeroboam would have said, oh, well, thanks for supporting me, and you can have this, and you can be the chief priest over here. No, he totally ignored them. In retrospect, he's not much different from Rehoboam, who ignored the plight of the northern tribes and said, I'm going to tax you and treat you just the way my father did. And here's Jeroboam, supposed to be their big liberator, and he treats the people who put him in power, the prophets and the priests who put him in power, he treats them with disdain. There was no Shiloh priest at Dan or Bethel, the two key places. And the thing was, if you read into the history of this, there was an old established group of priests at Dan who were reputed to be, or the part of the priesthood there had been founded by Moses' grandson. Now that's big stuff. A group of priests whose founder was Moses' grandson, most important person in the whole of the faith up till now, and they get pushed aside. And in fact, it was written of Jeroboam that if you wanted to be a priest under Jeroboam, you had to cross his palm with horses or mules or silver. In other words, you had to buy your way in. So you can see, before they even start, Israel's got the cracks. So that in the new religious structure then, no place for the Shiloh priests, the old guard, the people, who up till then are following, the same religion or the same branch of the religion as they were in Judah in the south. So now the northern tribes start to wander off, start to be something different. So what do you do if you're a priest in the northern country and suddenly you find yourself out of work? Well, you've got two choices. You can go to Judah, or you can do what many of them did, is eke out a living away from the main religious centres, Dan and Bethel, doing the local priest bit and trying to keep a low profile and go along. So the religion starts to take some hits, the practice of the religion. So the nation is now two. There's two nations, Israel and Judah. Okay? But they're related by a common language. They both speak the same. The traditions are the same. Moses and Abraham, all the same, how we got to where we are the same. It's a bit like North and South during the Civil War, where Christians, both North and South, both read the same Bible, both revered Jerusalem as the centre of the faith, both had the same traditions and the same styles of worship. The Northern Church was like a Southern Church. It's the same sort of situation. Now, as I said before, Israel's quite small in relation to the surrounding territories. And something you may have missed in your Bible reading, but Syria and Phoenicia broke away in Solomon's time. Solomon lost territories in his time. Edom broke away from Judah, the southern group, okay? And Israel had Moab, north, but they lost them as well. So now we've got two kind of vulnerable kingdoms, not too much around them as buffers. They're both new. I mean, Judah's not new in the sense that it's just started. It's obviously been there a while, a few hundred years, but Israel is sort of like Judah, but it's still new with new ideas and everything else. And they're very vulnerable. And the situation went on for about 200 years, which is, quite a long time, I grant you. But anyway, it did. Enough time for lots of traditions to have been built up in both sides, lots of new traditions in Israel, lots of small changes, if you will, to the way things were done. So, 200 years. But Israel's monarchy, very unstable. Now, Jeroboam already had ticked everybody off, or at least a lot of people off, by his choices. And what's interesting, if you read through the Bible, no one family held the throne for more than a couple of generations. It wasn't like a long-standing thing. And of course, as we know, because we read our history books, but in 722 BC, they were conquered by the Assyrians, Syria. Okay? They captured it. They deported a large percentage of the tribes, which became, the lost tribes of Israel. In other words, Syria took over the land, brought its own people in, and deported or captured or got rid of the people living there. Now, again, remember the size of things. When you think about that, you say, how could they remove thousands and thousands of people and just get rid of them? Well, it wasn't that many. It may be over a few thousand, but the point is they booted them out of the country, sent them off on their way, which is where we get the legends of the 10 tribes, all the stories. Where did they go? They went to Africa, they went to Spain, they went to Europe, they went to America. There's a good story there, by the way. One of these days we'll go into it. But they disappear. Okay? Judah, all right, whose now northern border is with Syria, or Syrian-controlled Israel, it lasted about another 100 years. So Judah, being more fortified, more organized, better standing army, managed to hold everybody off. And I'm skipping over a lot of individual history here because that's for another time. And plus the fact, we never get through this. But Judah lasted another 100 years. And during those 300 years, lived two of the writers that we're looking for. Each of those writers, and this is something I'm telling you now because we're going to deal with it in more detail. Each of those writers, whoever they were, each composed a version of their people's story. The writer from the southern kingdom wrote the story of how the Jews came to being and how they settled in Israel, and how the writer in Israel wrote the same story but with different viewpoints, with different heroes, as we'll see. Okay? All of those stories became part of the Bible. I mean, we have talked earlier on about the sources we call J and E. Yahweh and E, okay? Elohim. Remember that. Yahweh is one of the words for God. I've got to stop looking at the studio staff. They come in and waving at me. And E is for Elohim, because they're the people who call God Elohim, you see? So we've got two versions of the same story, two different names for God. I mean, look at the creation story. I love this one. From the J version of the Bible, we have in Genesis 1, God creates the world, and then he creates the plants, and then the animals, and then man, Adam, and then woman. Okay? And then we have the other version that comes a bit later on from the E source, if you will. We have man, first of all, then the plants, then the animals, and then, finally, the woman. All right? And we have various accounts of Noah's flood. We're going to go into Noah's flood in a bit of detail in a couple of programs down the road. But if you take the trouble to read Noah's flood, and there's two different versions of it, they're different. Different lengths of time, different amounts of animals, all sorts of things, all right? But anyway, what scholars finally realized, and which you probably have done in your Bible readings, is that this is not one book that repeats itself, but two books that have been merged together. But trust me, folks, that's what it is. And the first person, I mean, obviously more than one person, but the first person we know of who brought this to light was a gentleman called Henning Witter in 1711. He wrote a thing and said, what I think is what we got here is two books that have been merged together. Well, his comments had no impact and was largely forgotten at the time. And you have to realize he was sticking his neck way out to even mention the fact. This was at a time when Moses wrote the Bible, the Pope's in charge, and you better not stray from the given line or you're in trouble. Okay? But then along comes Jean Astruc, who's a French professor of medicine. For some reason or other, I don't know why. But anyway, he comes along, and he's quite an important guy. He's the chief physician to King Louis XV. So, we know who he is. There's even a painting of him somewhere. Okay? He published in secret in Brussels in 1753. He published in secret the same theory. And you say, well, why in secret? Well, possibly for the same reason as the other guy. That going against the established thought was not a good career thing, and obviously needed to protect his reputation. So, again, little impact. Nobody made much of a fuss about it. One or two points in history books about it, that's all. Maybe because he was a doctor and not a theologian. I don't know. Maybe they thought he didn't know what he was talking about. However, like a lot of things, the third time was a charm. The gentleman's name was Johann Gottfried Eichhorn. A very respected scholar of his time, and coincidentally the son of a pastor. So I assume that stood him in good stead when he was talking about biblical things. One of our technical people back there is the son of a pastor, and he knows nothing. So I don't know that that's a regular thing to do. I'm teasing. The man's very intelligent. But he divided the story into its two main sources. What Eichhorn did was say, okay, yes, it's more than one book. Let's go through and see if we can find where one starts, where one stops. And what he got down was stories or parts of the stories where God, the name for God is Elohim, is used. He called those E Elohim, all right? And the other parts of the stories, or repeats of the stories, or bits that have been merged together, where God is called Yahweh, they call it J. Actually, it was Y, which in German is a J, so it's called J. You don't need to know that, just that it's J, okay? His idea, and you can see how it developed, was that the Bible was a combination of two different works by two different people. And if you've read your Bible a lot and you've had confusion when you read things the same thing again, and you think, well, they just said that when it's different. Why is that? That will make, suddenly a light goes on and you go, ooh, that's good. Okay? You suddenly realize why you have two creation stories, why the flood story is different, why this chap does one thing here and then a few chapters later he does the same thing over here, but it's a different thing and a different name. Okay? Two different sources by two different people. And that theory lasted all of 18 years. So it didn't last very long. And if you stay with me, next week we'll continue tracing the story and I'll tell you what happened then. All right? Until then, read your Bible with a great deal more respect perhaps, and you'll understand it better. All right? Good night. God bless.